There's a ledger in Virginia no historian dares open. 40 names, 40 rejections, each written in the same trembling hand, the ink thinning near the end, as if the writer's strength was fading. The final entry doesn't mention a wedding, only a phrase that feels more like a curse than a record. Margaret Langford, transferred to quarters, November 12th. That line shouldn't exist. It's not the language of marriage. It's the language of property. This is where history fractures, where polite archives end and whispers begin. In the spring of 1847, the Langford plantation stood like a decaying cathedral of pride, built on red clay and silence. Its owner, Colonel Thaddeus Langford, returned from war carrying scars the world could see, and others it couldn't. Behind the walls of that Georgian manor, the air was thick with debt, desperation, and a sickness of the soul that money could no longer disguise. Margaret, his only surviving child, became his last transaction. A woman too large for her era, too kind for her father's ambition, and too visible for the society that refused to see her humanity. 40 suitors came. 40 men turned away, each rejection another nail in her coffin of isolation. But what history won't tell you is why those rejections came so swiftly. There are patterns in those letters. Identical phrasing, coordinated timing. It was sabotage, engineered humiliation, a social execution orchestrated by forces that understood that destruction doesn't always require violence. Sometimes, it only needs shame. By October, something in the Colonel snapped. He began writing letters again, but not to suitors this time. These letters were to lawyers, to trustees, to men who could move paper like knives. His wife's death had triggered a trust worth $30,000. Money he couldn't touch unless Margaret was established. In appropriate circumstances. But desperation erases morality, and what the Colonel defined as appropriate that winter would stain the soil of Virginia forever. They say the night before her transfer, every window in the Langford house reflected firelight that no one could source. The enslaved whispered that something had been promised in the dark, something not written in any ledger. History calls it madness, but madness doesn't write signatures that align with ritual geometry. And Margaret Langford's final record wasn't written by her father alone. It happened on a moonless night. The plantation was quiet, except for the low hiss of the wind moving through the tobacco fields like breath through clenched teeth. The enslaved knew something was wrong long before the carriage arrived. Animals sensed it too. Horses restless, dogs whining, even the owls fell silent as if the air itself refused to witness what was about to unfold. At exactly 11 past midnight, Colonel Langford emerged from the manor in full uniform. Not the attire of a grieving father, but of a commander marching into ritual. His boots were polished, his saber gleamed, and in his left hand, he carried a folded document sealed in black wax. Behind him, 2 overseers held lanterns, their light trembling against the fog. Between them walked Margaret, barefoot, her white nightgown dragging through mud, her hair undone, her eyes wide and vacant, as if she already knew her name had been erased from the house she once called home. The Colonel did not speak to her. He simply nodded toward the slave quarters, where a group of men stood waiting. Men who didn't understand why they'd been summoned, only that disobedience meant the whip. Hosea Drummond, the overseer, hesitated when he saw the Colonel's expression. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't order. This was something darker. He whispered to a field hand, "Don't look too long." The Colonel read from the document, his voice steady, formal, legal. Margaret Langford, transferred for domestic oversight in the quarters, per estate requirement. No one moved. The words hung in the cold air like a sentence carried from a higher court. Then, with mechanical precision, the Colonel turned, handed the document to Drummond, and walked back toward the house. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His work was done, but something followed him that night. A presence, a sound, a rhythm. The enslaved later said they heard humming coming from the quarters after Margaret disappeared inside. Not singing, humming, deep and low, as if 100 throats were resonating in unison beneath the earth. The dogs howled until dawn, and when the sun rose, a fog thicker than ash covered the fields. No one ever saw Margaret Langford again, but her name continued to appear in the plantation's ledgers for 3 more months. Written in handwriting that wasn't the colonel's. 3 months after Margaret's disappearance, the plantation began to rot from within. It wasn't decay that could be seen at first. It was something felt. The workers spoke in whispers, the overseers avoided the quarters after sunset, and the colonel's once imperious stride had turned into a slow, haunted pacing that echoed through the halls, like a metronome marking his descent. But what truly terrified the household wasn't the silence of the fields. It was the ledger. Every plantation kept records, births, deaths, work quotas, punishments, but after November 12, 1847, new entries began to appear in the Langford account. Book written in a style that mimicked the colonel's hand, yet deviated in subtle, impossible ways. The strokes were longer, the ink darker, the spacing too deliberate, as if whoever wrote them wanted to be recognized yet never identified. And every few nights, another entry appeared in the margin beside her name, compliant, attentive, awakening. The colonel burned the first 2 ledgers, believing some servant was mocking him. But the next morning, a fresh volume appeared on his desk, clean parchment, unblemished except for one line already written at the top. You cannot undo what has been transcribed. Hosea Drummond, the overseer, quit without a word 3 weeks later. He left behind his keys, his wages, and a note that read only, "The girl is still there." When the colonel stormed into the quarters to confront whatever he imagined, he found the cabins empty, tools neatly arranged, beds made, fires cold. The only sound was dripping water and something else beneath it. A low vibration, almost like breath. Neighbors began to notice the change. Fields that once thrived turned black at the roots. The oaks along the entrance road twisted toward the house, as if drawn to its sickness, and every night from the main hall came the faintest echo of footsteps descending the cellar stairs. Slow and deliberate, the colonel stopped sleeping. He sealed the doors to the basement with nails and scripture, but the sound continued. In February 1848, a traveling notary from Richmond arrived to finalize the Prescott Trust. He found the colonel gaunt, unshaven, and trembling when the notary asked for the whereabouts of his daughter to confirm her placement. Langford simply handed over a page torn from the ledger. It contained only one phrase repeated 3 times, "Margaret Langford, present." By early spring of 1848, whispers had begun to leak beyond the plantation walls. The Langford estate, once a symbol of order and lineage, had become a shadowed fortress of rumor. The colonel stopped attending church. Mail went unanswered. Deliveries were left at the gate and retrieved only at night. The enslaved were forbidden from entering the main house after sunset. Yet their torches could be seen trembling along the tree line, as if they feared what might crawl out of the manor more than what might wait inside. When the lawyers from Richmond finally arrived to finalize the inheritance, the colonel greeted them with the stiffness of a man wearing someone else's skin. His voice cracked when he spoke, the words practiced but hollow. They were 3 men, Prescott's legal representatives, stern, perfumed, and already disgusted by the decay around them. The senior among them, Mr. Hollingsworth, adjusted his gloves before stepping through the door, muttering that the place smelled like wet earth and sickness. Inside, the air was heavy with candle soot and old whiskey. The lawyers were seated in the dining room, where the portraits had been shrouded with black cloth. The colonel poured brandy, but did not drink. His hands shook as he slid a document across the table, a statement verifying that his daughter, Margaret Langford, had been formally relocated to the southern quarter for administrative duties. Hollingsworth frowned. "And this arrangement is ongoing?" "Yes," Langford rasped. "She is content." The lawyer exchanged glances with his partners. "Will require verification of her condition," he said. "In person." Something in the colonel's face changed. An imperceptible flicker of terror followed by exhaustion. "You may verify," he whispered. "But you'll go alone. I do not enter that ground anymore." So at dusk, lanterns were lit, and the three men followed the dirt path toward the quarters. The colonel remained behind, seated rigidly in his chair, eyes locked on the empty space across the table. Only two men returned. The third, Hollingsworth, was never seen again. His partners refused to speak of what they found. Only that one lantern was dropped, and one voice, Hollingsworth's, was heard shouting from inside a cabin that no longer stood when they looked back. The next morning, there was nothing left but a single page lying in the mud. It was torn from the ledger, and across it, written in that same elegant, impossible hand, were three words: "Debt settled. Daughter kept." After the Richmond incident, the Langford estate seemed to breathe on its own. Doors opened at odd hours. Windows cracked without cause. Even the livestock refused to graze near the western field, where the earth had begun to pulse with soft heat beneath the soil. The colonel ordered every servant to the barn for nightly roll call. Those who hesitated were whipped, though his voice trembled when he gave the command. He wasn't enforcing order anymore. He was bargaining with something he didn't understand. The ledger had grown thicker, its pages yellowed by a humidity no one could trace. Each dawn, a new entry appeared in the margins. Not written in ink, but burned. The letters etched as though pressed by a heated brand. They bore fragments of conversation, incomplete sentences, questions that no one remembered asking. "Did you hear it breathe?" She asked for water again. "Don't let it see you kneel." One night, the colonel tried to burn the book a final time. He carried it to the hearth, fed it to the flames, and watched it curl into smoke. But before dawn, it was back on his desk, unmarked, unburned, with a single new entry that read, "You owe her your breath." By the following week, servants began to vanish. Not run away, vanish. Their belongings left neatly on cots, shoes arranged, tools stacked. When the colonel questioned the remaining workers, they said nothing. Only one old woman, a washer named Leela, whispered that the girl walked again, barefoot through the halls, humming that same hymn Margaret used to sing when she thought no one could hear her. The colonel dismissed it as madness until one night he woke to the sound himself. Soft humming from behind the locked cellar door. He tried to pray, but the words failed. The nails he'd hammered into the door had fallen out, each one lying neatly in a row on the floorboards. When morning came, the colonel sealed the house. He dismissed the remaining staff, paid them in silence, and sent for no one. Locals said he spoke to the walls. Some claimed to see him walking the fields at dawn, his face lit by a lantern he no longer carried. By summer, the house was entirely still. No servants, no animals. Only a faint song in the evenings, echoing from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. And when travelers passed by, they swore the shutters blinked, like eyes learning to stay open. It was late August when the first sighting came. A group of freedmen traveling north stopped at a well near the Langford boundary and swore they saw a woman standing among the poplars. Barefoot, dressed in white. Her posture was strange, her head tilted too far, as if listening to something underground. When they called out, she didn't turn. She only raised one hand, pointing toward the manor, then lowered it slowly and walked backward into the mist. Word spread through the neighboring counties that Margaret Langford had returned. Some said she was alive, having fled her father's tyranny. Others whispered that she was something else entirely. An echo of guilt. Summoned by the blood debt the colonel refused to settle. The colonel himself hadn't been seen for weeks. Letters from Richmond piled up at his gate, unopened. When the sheriff finally entered the property, he found the front doors unlocked and the hall filled with melted candles, dozens of them, their wax pooled into one massive white formation that looked almost like bone. The air stank of iron and damp earth. On the dining table lay the ledger, open, breathing faintly, its pages trembling as though stirred by an invisible pulse. The last entry was dated the night before. It read, "She stands where I left her. She forgives me not." The sheriff called out, his voice echoing up the grand staircase. No answer. When he reached the study, he found the colonel seated at his desk, eyes open but lifeless, his hand frozen mid-writing. A quill had pierced his palm clean through. The ink beneath him was fresh, still glistening, and yet it wasn't ink. It was too thick, too red. The page beneath his hand bore a single phrase in that same, otherworldly script, "Debt reclaimed." But it was what lay beside him that silenced the room. A white dress, Margaret's, recognizable by the embroidery her mother had sewn years before, folded neatly, untouched by dust, and within its folds, strands of dark hair, still damp. That night, the sheriff ordered the manor sealed, but as he left the grounds, he turned back and saw movement in the upper windows, a figure framed by candlelight, hair loose, hand pressed against the glass. The faint sound of humming drifted across the field, the same lullaby heard by generations of workers before dawn. And though he swore he saw her lips move, the song was not sung. It was whispered, one word, over and over. When the manor was finally abandoned, the land seemed to swallow it. The fields turned to a dull gray, and the earth around the foundation cracked in spirals, like pottery baked too long in fire. Locals stopped taking the western road. They said the soil there was listening. But 20 years later, long after the war had come and gone, a new owner purchased the estate. His name was Elijah Crane, a northern investor eager to profit from the recovering South. He dismissed the rumors as superstition and ordered the manor restored. "A structure is just wood," he said. "Ghosts don't survive progress." His workers refused to dig near the cellar. The first man who tried claimed his shovel struck something soft, something that breathed. Crane laughed, took the shovel himself, and drove it deeper. The second strike brought up not wood, not stone, but a fragment of porcelain the size of a palm. Etched into it were words, "Margaret Langford, present." From that day forward, the restoration faltered. Clay dust coated the windows overnight. Paint peeled as soon as it dried. Tools went missing, then reappeared in strange formations, forming circles around the main hall. And every time Crane ordered the cellar opened, the workers quit the next morning without pay, so he descended alone. He described it later in his letters, pages now kept by the Virginia Historical Society. He wrote of a staircase that curved in ways stairs should not curve, descending into a space larger than the foundation itself. The air grew warm, heavy, almost alive, and on the lowest step he found impressions in the clay. Bare footprints, preserved perfectly, leading to a narrow door. Inside that door was a single chair. Upon it sat the ledger, impossibly intact. The last page fluttered as he approached, though there was no breeze. It bore a new entry written in his own hand, though he had never touched the quills. Elijah Crane, received. He fled that night. Witnesses in the nearby town swore they saw him walking barefoot, muttering about clay and breathing walls. His boots, found later at the edge of the property, were filled with soil, red, wet, and warm to the touch. When a surveyor returned weeks later, the manor was gone. No debris, no ash. Only the outline of its foundation pressed into the earth like a fingerprint. And in the center, a single porcelain shard, stamped with one word. In 1912, a regional historian named Clara Whitcomb visited the ruins of the Langford estate. She'd been cataloging forgotten plantations for a project funded by the Virginia Historical Archive. Maps, documents, local testimonies. She was not a woman who believed in hauntings. Her reputation depended on logic, on proof. But she also knew the value of folklore. Every myth began with a truth someone had tried to bury. When Clara arrived, the land was quiet. Too quiet. The road to the foundation had nearly vanished under moss and thorns. All that remained of the once grand house were 4 stone pillars and the faint, uneven rise of the cellar mound. She took photographs, measurements, and soil samples. But as dusk fell, she noticed something strange in her glass plates, faint impressions, almost like fingerprints, marring the negatives. The marks formed letters, and Langford. That night, Clara camped near the site, determined to finish her notes by lantern light. Around midnight, the ground beneath her shifted. It wasn't an earthquake. It was rhythmic, like slow, steady breathing. She pressed her palm to the soil and felt warmth pulsing through it. Then came the sound, a low, resonant hum that grew into something like a voice, though not quite human. She ran to her tent, fumbling for her field journal. When she opened it, her handwriting was gone. Every page had been replaced with new text, written in looping cursive, that shimmered faintly under the lantern flame. The first line read, "Archivist, you are not the first." By dawn, Clara was gone. Her equipment was later found by a search party, arranged neatly beside the collapsed cellar. Her camera tripod had been driven into the ground like a marker, its glass plates stacked on top. Every photograph showed the same thing, the ruins of the manor. But in each frame, a woman stood by the pillars, her face turned away, her dress flowing as though caught in a breeze. Weeks later, the archive received an envelope postmarked from Richmond with no return address. Inside was a single page, handwritten, dated in Clara's meticulous script. The ink was black, but faintly iridescent, as if mixed with ash. It read, "The Langfords built their legacy from breath and clay. Now both have taken shape. She is awake beneath the earth, and she remembers every name that wrote her down." The bottom of the page bore one final word, pressed, not written by 1934. The Langford story had faded into half-believed legend, a rural haunting whispered among archivists and genealogists, dismissed as superstition. Only one man kept pursuing it, a reclusive librarian named Thaddeus Cole, an expert in colonial record-keeping who worked for the Library of Shadows, a private collection in Baltimore dedicated to lost legalities. Cole was fascinated by how the Langford ledger kept reappearing across decades, each time with new entries written in contemporary hands. When he heard of Clara Whitcomb's disappearance, he wrote to the Virginia Archive requesting access to her field notes. They refused, citing unexplained contamination of materials. So Cole went himself. He arrived in Richmond that winter unshaven, with a satchel of quills and his own ink. He never trusted typewriters. He spent weeks reading every document tied to the Langford Trust. Each copy was inconsistent, names shifted, dates rearranged. In one version, Margaret was recorded as deceased in 1847. In another, she was listed as transferred for domestic duty in 1852. But in every surviving document, no matter the copyist, one word appeared at the bottom in faint, gray lettering, present. Cole grew obsessed. He tracked the original ledger to a private vault under the courthouse, sealed in a lead box after the war. Despite warnings, he requested to see it. The clerk, visibly shaken, made him sign a waiver stating the library was not responsible for any resulting disorientation. That night, Cole opened the box. Inside, wrapped in linen, was the ledger, its leather binding cracked but alive with faint warmth. He flipped to the first page. It was blank. Then, slowly, letters began to emerge from the fibers, bleeding upward like rising ink. They formed a line that stole his breath. "Welcome, keeper of names." He read until dawn, transcribing feverishly. The entries were written as if the book knew the future wars yet fought, deaths unrecorded, and even the hour of his own heart's final beat. But what terrified him most were the new entries written as he read. Sentences describing his every movement, his every breath. Cole vanished 2 days later. The vault was found locked from the inside, his chair overturned, his satchel torn open. The ledger sat on the table, open to the middle page. Written there in his precise hand was the final entry Thaddeus Cole recorded. Present. And below that, faintly pressed into the page, a single fingerprint, made not of ink but clay. By 1952, the Langford tale had become a curiosity for fringe historians and late-night radio hosts. The name Margaret Langford circulated on obscure stations devoted to ghost stories and Southern curses. Most dismissed it as local myth, until station WNRV in Norfolk broadcast something it couldn't explain. The program was called The Hour Between Worlds, hosted by Dr. Ellery Shaw, a parapsychologist who claimed to investigate haunted archives. On June, during a live episode about haunted documents, he played what he described as a recovered phonograph recording from 1934, the supposed voice of Thaddeus Cole. The audio began with static, then a man's voice murmuring names, each one followed by the word, present. It was unsettling, but ordinary enough for ghost enthusiasts. Then, midway through the broadcast, the frequency warped. Listeners reported hearing not static but breathing, slow, deliberate, synchronized with the pulsing of the signal itself. A woman's voice joined in, faint and distant, whispering beneath the hum. She wasn't speaking English, at least, not entirely. Experts later described it as colonial syntax fractured through repetition. The only intelligible words were ledger and below. Shaw tried to cut the feed, but the board locked. The transmitter engineer later swore every dial moved on its own, fixing the signal to 1847 metches, the same number as Margaret's recorded year of death. For nearly 6 minutes, the transmission looped a single phrase over and over, growing clearer each time. This is Margaret Langford. The record continues, present. When the station finally went silent, half of Norfolk lost power. Shaw was found slumped over the console, alive but unresponsive, eyes wide and unfocused. He was later confined to St. Helena Asylum, where he filled notebook after notebook with vertical columns of names, most belonging to people who hadn't yet been born. The broadcast tape was confiscated by federal agents 2 days later. Officially, they claimed it was a magnetic malfunction, but technicians who handled it reported a physical warmth emanating from the reel, as though the tape itself had a pulse. Weeks later, the same frequency, 1847 Mets, began transmitting again at midnight. There was no announcer, no signal ID, just a faint sound of pages turning, and every so often, a woman's voice whispering softly between the static. By 1971, the Langford phenomenon had crossed into academic circles under a different name. The Collector of Breath. The title came from a dissertation submitted to Miskin University by Dr. Harold Ames, an anthropologist studying the psychological residue of colonial violence. His paper argued that the Langford ledger wasn't cursed. It was alive, an organic archive, created by centuries of trauma, memory, and unatoned sin. He suggested that the plantation soil, rich with human remains and sweat, had become a living conduit for unfinished histories. But Amos's interest wasn't just academic. He'd somehow acquired fragments of the ledger. 6 loose pages, sealed in glass for preservation. Each page bore faint fingerprints and strange indentations that pulsed faintly when exposed to heat. Ames kept them in his study, claiming they emitted small drafts of air, as though breathing. Within months, his students noticed changes. The air in his office grew humid, metallic. His lectures became erratic. He'd pause mid-sentence and whisper the word, present, as though responding to a roll call only he could hear. When colleagues confronted him, he insisted that the ledger was awakening, and that it remembered those who tried to silence it. One night, security guards found his lab door ajar. The pages were missing. His desk was covered in soil thick and red. Ames was found collapsed in the corner, alive but speechless, his lungs moving in short, shallow gasps, as if someone else were breathing through him. When he was hospitalized, nurses reported a faint whisper escaping his mouth each time he exhaled. Record kept. The next morning, one of his assistants discovered a new page inside the sealed archive vault. The handwriting matched Amos's, but he was still in a coma. The page contained only a single paragraph. Every breath feeds the ledger. Every witness becomes entry. The air is her scripture now, and those who inhale are bound to remember. Below the text, a smudge shaped like lips pressed into the parchment. Ames died 3 days later. The coroner noted that his lungs were filled with an unknown clay-like substance, though his throat showed no obstruction. The autopsy report was sealed. But that winter, students began hearing soft breathing in the archive stacks, always near the ventilation grates, and sometimes, if you stood there long enough, a voice would drift through the ducts and whisper, very gently. By 1989, the Langford story had slipped into the background of American folklore, appearing in obscure books about haunted places and residual consciousness. Yet among archivists and sound engineers, there was a quiet consensus. Something about the air near the old plantation site wasn't right. Audio recordings taken within a 2-mile radius carried distortions, breathing patterns that didn't match the speaker, faint background murmurs that formed words when slowed down. The phenomenon drew a small government research team under the pretext of studying geological gas emissions. Leading the project was physicist Dr. June Merritt, who specialized in low-frequency resonance. She and her crew erected microphones, barometers, and air samplers across the property, hoping to map the sub-audible hum locals claimed to hear on windless nights. For the first 2 days the results were normal. Then the humidity spiked, briefly reaching levels impossible for the season. Every instrument began registering a rhythmic pressure fluctuation, almost identical to human respiration, 11 cycles per minute. Merritt laughed at first, calling it a coincidence of airflow and faulty sensors, but when she reviewed the audio spectrograms, her smile vanished. The frequencies were layered complex, like a chorus trying to synchronize. That evening, she set up a controlled microphone in the cellar remains. The tape ran for 7 hours. When played back, it began with static, then the faint sound of paper turning. A voice followed, not electronic interference, but clear and direct. You measure what cannot end. Merritt froze the recording, thinking it was a prank. Yet the voice repeated, slower this time, overlapping itself in different tones. You breathe, therefore you write. The next morning, Merritt and 2 assistants were gone. Their tents were undisturbed, equipment still running. Only the playback reel remained, looping endlessly between 2 points. The moment the voice spoke, and the sound of 3 slow exhalations afterward. Later analysis found no cuts, no edits. Within weeks, the research files were classified. A single page from Merritt's field log leaked to a science journal before being retracted. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, as though written under dictation. The air here is not empty. It is a witness. When it moves through lungs, it remembers shape, name, and guilt. The wind itself is ledger now. Below the entry was a symbol, a perfect spiral drawn in red dust. And beneath it, one word pressed into the paper, as though by invisible fingers. When state surveyors returned to Langford Land in 1992 to prepare for a private development, they uncovered something that should have been impossible. A buried ledger sealed in glass and lead, resting beneath the roots of an oak that predated the Civil War. The soil around it was undisturbed, compacted as though the tree itself had grown from the container. Inside, the ink was still legible. It wasn't Margaret's handwriting. It was the colonel's. Every page was an inventory. Not of crops, not of finances, but of names, 58 of them, each followed by a single Latin word: servatus, corpus, sanguis ignis. The pattern repeated: slave, body, blood, fire. Then at the very bottom, written in a different hand, a woman's, Margaret's, was one final entry: me culpa mea vita. My guilt, my life. Experts tried to carbon date the ink, but the results were contradictory. The paper was from 1847. The ink somehow was manufactured in 1912, and the glass surrounding it had microscopic fractures that suggested pressure from within, as if something had breathed against it over time. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Thomas Greer, refused to continue. His assistant, however, ignored the warning and photographed every page. Within 72 hours, those photographs vanished from both the physical archive and every backup drive they'd been copied to. Only one survived. A low-resolution scan leaked to an underground history forum. It showed a faint handprint over the final words, the ridges of the print not human but spiral, curling inward to a vanishing point. What none of the researchers knew, or what they refused to see, was that this ledger completed a pattern. When overlaid with the original marriage record from 1847, every rejected suitor's name corresponded perfectly with one of the enslaved individuals buried in the plantation cemetery. 40 men, 40 graves, and one woman who connected them all. The county sealed the site. The oak was cut down under the guise of invasive root control, but those who handled the wood reported it was warm to the touch, even after weeks in storage. One man said it pulsed, faintly, like a heart. He burned it that same night, yet found the ashes arranged on his doorstep the next morning, in the shape of the same spiral found in Merritt's notebook. And underneath, scrawled in what looked like iron dust, was a single phrase: every name must return. By 1997, the Langford property had been officially erased from county maps. Developers paved over the access road, and the remaining acreage was sold to a private holding company whose owners couldn't be traced. But something else began happening, quietly, persistently. In the small towns surrounding the former plantation, men bearing the same surnames as those 40 original suitors began dying in their sleep. No struggle, no poison, no cause. Just silence. The local coroner called it unexplained cardiopulmonary failure. The newspapers called it coincidence. But the old families whispered, the names are returning. A few of them compared obituaries, and the pattern became undeniable. Each death occurred on a date corresponding to one of the rejection entries in the 1847 ledger, exactly 150 years apart to the day. The handwriting on the death certificates, digital or not, always bore a faint curl at the base of the signature, like the spiral in Merritt's notes. When Dr. Greer, the archaeologist who'd led the excavation, saw the pattern, he fled to Europe. But before he left, he mailed a single envelope to a historian named Lydia Finch. Inside was a thin, yellowed slip of paper containing only 6 words. It was never a marriage ledger. Finch began researching what the Connell might have really done, and that's when she discovered the reversal. Every rejected suitor's name wasn't just a record of failure, it was an invocation, written backward in certain places, mirrored like runes. Langford itself, when reversed in Old Scots Gaelic, formed a phrase meaning, to bind the living to debt. Finch published her findings in an academic blog post that disappeared within 24 hours, but cached fragments remain. She had linked the Connell's transfer of Margaret to the enslaved quarters not as punishment or madness, but as the fulfillment of an older ritual of atonement. The wealthy would bind their heirs' names to the lives of the enslaved, one soul bearing the burden of another. Yet something went wrong that night in 1847. The binding inverted. Margaret did not atone for the family's sins. She inherited them. The ledger wasn't an act of record-keeping. It was containment. Finch's last note, before her account was deleted, read simply, he gave her away because he couldn't destroy her. The ritual was meant to end the curse. Instead, it anchored it. The names don't die, they return. And beneath it, an image attachment corrupted into 3 words, before vanishing completely. The first time it happened again was on November 12, 1997, exactly 150 years to the night of Margaret's transfer, at 11:42 p.m. Emergency dispatchers in Pittsylvania County, began receiving calls from residents near the old plantation ruins. They reported flames, dozens of them, burning low across the fields like a string of lanterns. Yet when fire crews arrived, there was no blaze, no heat, not even smoke. Just circles of scorched earth, 40 of them, each perfectly round, each the same diameter as a grave. Thermal imaging cameras picked up something else. A faint outline of movement inside the rings, colder than the ground around it. One technician described it as human silhouettes walking backward. The footage was confiscated within hours, filed under the Department of Agriculture's controlled burn anomaly. But a copy leaked 3 months later. Those who watched it claimed to hear voices embedded in the static. The words were nearly indistinguishable, except for one phrase repeated across all 40 frequencies. "We remember." That same week, descendants of the Langford line began reporting identical dreams. Each one described standing before a door that opened inward, revealing not a room but a downward spiral of soil and bone. A woman's voice whispered from below, calm and commanding, "You will balance what your fathers stole." Most dismissed it as stress. A few didn't. Those few either vanished or were found days later in rural motels, their mirrors shattered, their skin marked with faint circular scars, as if branded by unseen heat. Historians now believe that the 40 fires marked a reactivation of the binding. A moment when every suppressed name sought to reclaim its debt. The land itself, poisoned by denial, was exhaling its history. And the ritual that had been meant to silence a legacy of ownership had begun to reverse again. But here's what you're not supposed to know. The recordings from that night weren't just found in Virginia. Identical acoustic signatures were detected simultaneously in Mississippi, Louisiana, and South Carolina, every state that once held Langford tobacco contracts. The resonance wasn't local. It was networked, a pattern of names, debts, and descendants pulsing through time like a dormant code. And somewhere beneath that pattern, breathing through the static, still waiting for acknowledgement, was the same voice Dr. Merritt captured years earlier. Every fire is an eye, every name a window. The spiral, it seemed, had begun to open. In 2003, a freelance archivist named Caleb Rourke was hired by a Virginia museum to digitize forgotten land records. Among them, he found a mislabeled file titled Langford, Private Holdings 1840-1850. Inside was a letter written by Colonel Langford himself, sealed with black wax. The handwriting trembled near the end, as though written by candlelight in a shaking hand. It read, "The transfer is complete. The girl is not mine, nor theirs. I have bound the estate to her form. May her weight bear what we could not." O'Rourke, a rational man, laughed at first. But when he scanned the letter, the OCR software refused to translate it. Each attempt produced a string of reversed phrases and corrupted sigils that formed a spiral on the monitor. He saved the file, named it Ledger 47, PDF, and tried to open it again. The screen flashed black, and then displayed a single image. A crude sketch of a woman's face, swollen and indistinct, eyes replaced by hollow circles. He assumed it was a glitch until the sketch began appearing in other folders. Embedded in photos, hidden behind thumbnails, even replacing corporate logos on his desktop. When he checked the system clock, it showed the year 1847. Within days, Rourke became obsessed. He began printing the corrupted files, taping them across the walls of his small Richmond apartment. Neighbors heard him muttering at night, repeating words that didn't sound like English. When his employer finally performed a wellness check, they found the apartment empty. Only one wall remained untouched. A perfect spiral of documents leading inward to a missing sheet. That missing page was later discovered inside the museum's printer tray. It contained coordinates, latitude and longitude, pointing to the exact center of the Langford property. Beneath the coordinates was a phrase in mirrored text: "Archivists are keepers of the curse." Weeks later, hikers found a single burnt circle at that location, with an open laptop resting in its center. The screen displayed a paused video, Rourke's face, eyes wide, whispering the same line over and over. "She's remembering me now." Then, a female voice, low and distant. "Memory is not linear. You opened the door backward." Experts reviewing the footage confirmed there was no visible source for the voice. The timestamp matched the anniversary of the 40 fires, exactly 6 years later. And behind his final frame, barely visible in the flicker of static, the spiral burned itself into the soil once again. By 2009, whispers of the Langford spiral had migrated from historians' forums to encrypted paranormal networks. Researchers began calling it a pattern of memory recursion, a system of echoes triggered by human attention. The more one studied the Langford case, the more frequently anomalies occurred. Reversed audio in phone calls, faces appearing in reflections, phantom latency on devices. A signal that fed on observation. That year, a graduate student at Tulane University, Mara Iverson, began compiling a database of every documented mention of the plantation since 1847. Within 3 months, her data showed something horrifying. The number 40 appeared with mathematical precision across all related archives. 40 land deeds, 40 letters, 40 descendants in each generation, 40 confirmed disappearances linked to the property. Even the waveform of Dr. Merritt's final recording, when visualized, formed 40 perfect rings. Mara theorized that the 40 fires and every recurrence since were manifestations of an unfinished ritual, one seeking completion through replication. She wrote, "The ledger was not written to bind bodies. It was written to bind attention. We are the ritual now." On October 12, 2009, she streamed a live experiment to prove it. In front of a small online audience, she played a reconstructed version of the Langford audio, reversing it, layering it 40 times to close the loop. For 17 minutes, nothing happened. Then the stream cut to black. When the video returned, Mara was gone. Her empty chair swayed slightly, though no draft was visible. A faint hum, measured later at 47 as, filled the background, pulsing like a slowed heartbeat. Within 24 hours, users who had watched the stream began reporting nosebleeds, migraines, and auditory distortions. One viewer claimed to hear a woman's voice emerging from her laptop at 3:07 a.m., whispering her name 3 times before falling silent. The video vanished from the internet the next day, but not before being mirrored on 40 anonymous accounts. Each copy bore a different title, yet all shared the same final frame, a close-up of Mara's computer screen, displaying a single line of text. "If you look long enough, she learns your name." By the end of that month, 40 viewers had deleted their accounts, citing recurring dreams of a woman speaking through glass. And when one of them smashed her monitor in panic, investigators found something carved beneath the shattered casing. "The choir is hollow because she listens." In 2013, a team of independent documentarians calling themselves the Black Acre Project traveled to Virginia to film what they called the Langford recursion. Their leader, Eli Mort, was a former theology student turned digital anthropologist obsessed with ritual contagion. The idea that belief itself could infect data. Morton believed the Langford curse wasn't supernatural at all but a self-replicating information pattern, a mimetic wound coded in language. He wanted to capture it on camera and disprove it. The crew set up base near the remnants of the plantation's old water well, a collapsed shaft locals referred to as the mirror. Legend said that if you looked into it on the anniversary of the 40 fires, you wouldn't see your reflection, but someone else's, usually a woman's face, pale and swollen, whispering something only you could hear. Morton dismissed it as folklore until the first night of shooting. When he reviewed the drone footage, every frame that passed over the well contained a flicker, like a reflection from below ground, though the shaft was filled with earth. Slowing it down revealed something impossible: 40 pale shapes, arranged in a spiral formation facing upward. Their eyes were open. Their mouths moved in unison, though no sound registered on the equipment. Morton, shaken, ordered another drone pass. The second camera transmitted for only 37 seconds before freezing. The feed showed Morton's own face, reflected in the well water, but inverted, his lips moving before his body did, as though the reflection were speaking first. Then the image fractured into 40 mirrored fragments. The footage ends abruptly, but local police reports confirm that one crew member, Lydia Sen, was found wandering the woods the next morning, barefoot and muttering, "We were supposed to record, not repeat." The rest of the team was never found. Weeks later, a single email appeared in Morton's archived account, timestamped at 3:47 a.m., 2 days after the team vanished. The sender field was blank. The message contained a video attachment titled Mirror 47, MP4. It showed the well again, moonlight shimmering over the surface. A voice, female, deliberate, whispered from somewhere below, "They look into me thinking I am depth. But I am memory, waiting to remember itself." Experts who examined the clip noted that the reflection visible in the water was not Morton's, nor anyone from the missing crew. It was unmistakably Margaret Langford, eyes open, lips trembling, as if preparing to speak again. In early 2020, the Langford estate appeared again, this time as metadata. During a routine update of the Virginia Historical Archives, digital technicians noticed a 4.7 gigabyte file automatically downloading into their servers, titled simply FAR-TY. Nemes, Retour and Eid. It wasn't part of any network repository, and no record of its upload existed. Attempts to delete it failed. Every time it was removed, it recreated itself under a new name. 40-fold return, ledgered open, Margaret speaks. The file contained no readable documents, only audio, 40 separate tracks, each exactly 1 minute long. The first 39 began with the same pattern: a name, spoken clearly by a woman's voice, followed by the sound of shallow breathing and faint scratching, as if someone were writing on wood. The 40th file was different. It began with silence, then a deep, slow inhale. A second voice, male trembling, whispered, "Forgive us." The woman answered, "I already did." That is why it continues. Within days of the file's discovery, 40 employees at the archive reported a series of identical dreams. Each dream involved a staircase descending beneath a tobacco field, ending at a door made of glass. Behind the door stood a woman whose skin reflected candlelight, as if it were water. She didn't speak. But every dreamer woke with the taste of ash in their mouths, and the faint imprint of a spiral pressed into their palms. The digital forensics team traced the voice pattern across the global internet. To their horror, the same spectral frequency that had appeared in 1997, the 40 Fire's resonance, was now embedded invisibly in music streams, voicemail compression, even white noise apps. The curse had migrated. What once needed land now needed only listening. Lydia Finch's old blog reappeared briefly around that time. A single update, dated unknown, was posted before the domain vanished again. The ledger is not an object. It is a living archive. We are its pages. Every time her name is spoken, the ink renews itself. And below that, in red text, one final warning: there are now more than 40. The servers hosting FAR-TY Nemes, Retour and shut down without human command 2 weeks later. All backups failed, but anyone who had ever opened the file, even for a second, found a new folder on their personal devices afterward. It contained nothing except a blank document named after them. When opened, the cursor blinked once and began to type by itself. By late 2024, the Langford phenomenon was no longer confined to history or folklore. It had become something self-sustaining, a ghost written in data. Linguists studying the FAR-TY Nemes Retour and ND frequencies noticed a chilling development. The waveform itself had begun to form symbols, circles folding into circles, like an eye closing and reopening. Each full rotation lasted exactly 40 seconds, as if the signal were breathing. Around the same time, people across the eastern United States began reporting strange auditory events. Whispers emerging from malfunctioning earbuds, harmonics within static, even the sound of heavy breathing when no device was powered on. The voices said different things to each listener, yet one phrase was always the same: the ledger remembers. Then came the blackout. On December 12, 2024, 40 power substations across 5 states failed simultaneously for precisely 47 minutes. Surveillance footage showed a faint amber glow radiating from the soil beneath the affected areas, spreading outward in spirals before vanishing. Government agencies called it a geomagnetic anomaly, but engineers who analyzed the ground readings discovered trace voltage patterns forming the same structure as the Langford family seal. In the months that followed, scattered reports emerged from those who had once studied the curse. Archivists, historians, descendants of the 40 Suitors. Each vanished under inexplicable circumstances. Apartments left unlocked, lights still burning, laptops open to blank documents. On every screen, the cursor blinked in rhythm: 40 blinks, pause, 40 more. And then, silence. No new anomalies, no unexplained audio. For the first time in more than a century, the pattern ceased. Some called it closure, others believed it had merely shifted form, hiding in language itself. After all, every account of the Langford case contained the same shape: repetition, reflection, recursion. The spiral was not a symbol of possession. It was a method of memory. 2 months later, a researcher reviewing these transcripts noticed something impossible. The total word count of every known document concerning the Langford family from 1847 to the present added up to exactly 47,040 words. 40 for the names, 40 for the fires, 40 for the echoes. He closed his notes, turned off the light, and heard a single knock from inside the wall. Soft, patient, like someone asking to be read again. "If you speak her name," a voice said, "the ledger opens. If you write it, you join it. The story ends here, unless, of course, you've been reading aloud."